had it in mind ever since prep school I would like to go be a lawyer. My father liked the idea. He was not a lawyer, but he was a businessman. He employed lawyers often, and he thought it was a very good thing to get a law degree and get admitted to the bar, even if you didn't practice. My father was in a business that's no longer in existence. It was called naval stores, and it meant pine tar and turpentine and that kind of thing that were used in the sailing ships. They used the pine tar to tar the rigging and so on. And that was produced in Florida and Georgia.
Was that right?
And my father didn't produce it, but he would buy it from the producers, ship it up on ships, usually a deck cargo, maybe in casks. And then he had a yard in Brooklyn on the waterfront, what the children called the pigsty building, because it was a very shabby shed, you know, it wasn't fancy at all. It was full of these barrels of different kinds of naval stores. And the job, of course, was to predict the usage. In other words, it's produced in a season.
Right.
But then the paint companies and others that buy it, they don't have a season necessarily, or the season is different. And maybe you would buy the turpentine in the spring, and then you wouldn't get a chance to sell it at a reasonable price until maybe October.
Yeah.
So you keep it in the yard until you got your price. And of course you could get stuck with it and not sell it, or you could be lucky and sort of corner the market and be the only one who had the material at the time the paint companies wanted it.
Yeah.
Well, that's all been replaced by the petroleum industry, which has produced various kinds of bases for paint and even water-based paint, so that nobody's buying much turpentine now, maybe a little to clean brushes, and that's about all.
Yeah. How long was he in the business?
Well, he was in business, he was born in 1853. He was married in 1900. I know he was in business from about 1880 on, but part of the time may have been with his uncles who were cotton merchants. He was just a kind of a office boy starting out and learning the ropes, and then he set up his own business. And by the time I was born in 1910, he had retired from the naval stores business, and he still maintained an office on Beaver Street, New York, and I used to go over there to his office as a child and bang on the typewriter and take the rubber stamps and stamp the deposit slips and things. I enjoyed it. Had an old-fashioned safe, one of these safes that the base of it was as big as this table and it went as high as your head, and had a roll-top desk.
Great. Now, was your dad, was he always New York City? Is that where he's from?
Was he always from New York City?
Yeah.
Yes. His ancestors came from Salem, Massachusetts. One of the Blossoms was on the Speedwell, which was the ship that started with the Mayflower, had to turn back because of a leak, and then it came over the next year. There was a Thomas Blossom on that ship, and my father was one of his descendants and moved from Salem, Massachusetts in about 1820 to Brooklyn Heights.
No kidding.
Brooklyn Heights was an elevated area that overlooked the harbor. It was where George Washington slipped away from the British. He nearly got beaten there, but he slipped away in the night and got over to Manhattan. I was born at Quogue, Long Island, which is where the family had a summer cottage. Having 5 children, they needed a place where children could run around, and so we had a Victorian-style house there. Well, I was brought up in Rochester, New York, and she was very fond of art, and she used to illustrate for St. Nicholas and other magazines, had a studio in her home, and she was going to Europe with the family to arrange to go to an art school in Paris. But she met my father on the boat, and that ended the idea of going to Paris. So they toured Europe, her family, her brother, and her parents, and then ended up in London where they were engaged. And that was in the year 1899, and in May 1900 they were married in Rochester. They then took a wedding trip out to the West because my father was not only in business, but he was an investor after he retired from business.
Oh, no kidding.
And he had interest in gold mines out in the West, so they went down deep in gold mines at places like Cripple Creek and so on. And it was kind of wild then. No hotels, you stayed in tents.
Yeah.
But they were there in the summer, so it wasn't too bad to stay in a tent. And everywhere they went was on horseback in those days. There were no buses and no rent-a-cars.
Was he successful?
Was she successful as an artist? Yes.
Yeah.
Some of her work I have outside there. I can show it to you.
Yeah, that'd be terrific. Now, how about your dad and his investments? Did he feel he was successful in his investments?
Yes, I think he was successful. He sent 5 children through college, and any who wanted to go to graduate school, they went to graduate school. So I think he was successful. He always said that not everybody can make a fortune, but anybody can save a competence.
Mm-hmm.
So he used to be quite thrifty. In the summer on Long Island, he always had a vegetable garden and could feed the family largely from the garden. Then we'd bring barrels of stuff back to Brooklyn Heights, squash and melons and stuff like that, corn. He was one who didn't spend money on himself, but he would spend money on the education of his children.
Yeah.
My older sister went to Wellesley, graduated with honors. My next sister went to Parsons School of Fine Applied Art in New York City and was very successful. And then my brother went to Princeton and graduated in the class of 31. My younger sister went to a 2-year college in Brooklyn and then a secretarial school and became a secretary to a lawyer and learned a lot from that experience.
Sure.
Later she married a Presbyterian minister, and she's now 85 and lives in a Presbyterian retirement home in Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania. I started off in the Friends School in Brooklyn, which is a Quaker school. I was very glad to learn about Quaker meetings and so on as we attended those. And then in 3rd grade, I was transferred to what was called Brooklyn Heights Seminary. It was a school for boys and girls, and went from 3rd grade to high school and on to college preparatory. And it was a very family-like school, not large, but they had religious services every morning to start school. I remember some of the prayers that I couldn't understand at all, like vouchsafe, we beseech thee. Well, I had no idea what that meant. But it was good to be exposed to it. And then at 5th grade, I went to Polytechnic Preparatory Country Day School on Dyker Heights near Fort Hamilton in the Narrows where the ships all come in.
Right.
And our football field was separated by a fence from the mule pen where the mules were kept for drawing the wagons that drew any kind of military vehicle, whether it was a caisson or a field piece or whatever.
Yeah.
So I went there for 3 years and then transferred to Salisbury School in Connecticut, which is a 5-year boarding school, college preparatory, with lots of Latin, lots of English and English history. I knew the order of the kings of England, even though I didn't know the presidents of the United States. It was thoroughly English. The teachers were all male. They wore academic gowns when they taught. They wore the mortarboards in class and in chapel all the time that they were on duty. So after 5 years there, I was accepted at Princeton, and I went to Princeton because my father felt I should take ROTC. And Williams, where most of my friends were going, did not have ROTC. I'm very glad I took ROTC because it meant that I attended drills and summer camps and got to be a first lieutenant, so that when Pearl Harbor came and I got my telegram, of course I was expecting it and I had my trunk locker already packed, I got my orders to report to Fort Bragg and took a 1-month refresher course in artillery because we had had training on the French 75, but they were just introducing the 105 howitzer,
Right.
which is a bit different. So I took that course. At the end of the course, to my surprise, I'd expected to go to Fort Sill for a 3-month course. All my classmates went to Fort Sill, but they pulled my card out because I was a lawyer and decided that I should do administrative work. I became assistant adjutant of the 5th Field Artillery Training Regiment. And that was where the adjutant said to me, there are various ways of doing things. The right way, the wrong way, the Army way, and the Field Artillery Training Center way. We did it the Field Artillery Training Center way. Well, I learned a lot from that adjutant, and after a little more than a year of doing much court-martial work and work on boards of different kinds, as for instance when a person died in the service, you had a line of duty board to determine whether he died in line of duty or whether he didn't. I went to Harvard Law School and I completed 2 years. Then my father was beginning to lose his sight, and it was Depression time, and money was scarce, and it was decided that I could do just as well by going to New York University Law School, staying home and helping my father in the evenings, which I did, and I'm glad I did because Harvard Law School taught you the common law very well, but they didn't try to teach you New York law, California law, Massachusetts law, and so on. So I had 2 years at New York University where they taught you New York law. For instance, the New York rule against perpetuities was quite different from the rule in Massachusetts, different from the common law. So I was glad to get that double training. I graduated from New York University School of Law in June 1936. And then I continued my studies in the evening while working for a law firm and got my JSD in 1941.
My golly.
And that was helpful too, because in 1941, toward the end of the year, I got my telegram to report to Fort Bragg. And that JD and JSD made a difference when you got assignments.
Yeah.
I figured you knew some law. I did have Roscoe Pound.
Oh, did you?
In property law, Property 1, where we learned about feri naturae. For evidence in the second year, I had a man they called Happy Jack McGuire, and he was good. And then there was Zachariah Chafee. You may have heard of him.
That name?
He taught equity. And see, if I can remember one of his stories. One of his stories about jurisdiction and divorce was that if the wife is in one state, domiciled there, and the husband is in another state, domiciled there, question of jurisdiction turns up, but you can, it's like an elephant with its feet in one, its 4 feet in one state and its rear in the other. You can shoot either end of the elephant, the place.
Then after you got done with law school, you worked for a law firm in New York City?
Yes, Alexander and Green, a very old firm. During the summer, I'd worked for Lord Day and Lord, which represented the Cunard Line and other maritime organizations, and represented the New York Times. But they were taking on some of the partners' own sons, and they told me they didn't have room for me. So they were very kind and introduced me to Alexander and Green. Unfortunately, Alexander and Green was kind enough to take me, although I really, as I look back on it now, I was an utter dummy. I didn't have any idea about things like how many copies of a certain thing you needed. They didn't have the Xerox machines then. You had to tell the secretary how many carbons you needed, and lots of things I needed to learn. I did know some things that I learned in a summer job at Lord Day and Lord. Like I did know where the different courts were, and I knew how to look up index numbers and things like that in the court. But I was not really very much asset to Alexander and Green for a year or more. And then, after a year in the bullpen they had for young men, where we took all the incoming mail, sorted it, sent it to the correct partner, and if it needed a diary entry like 20 days to answer or move, we would have to put that in the diary and indicate who was to get notice before the proper deadline date. Well, I moved out of that as quickly as I could because I really didn't like court rules on how many copies of this and that, and when you had to file appeals and so on. I liked wills, trusts, estates, and so whenever I got a chance to do that work, I did it first and did it quickly. And the result was that the partner in charge asked for me.
Great.
And I moved into an office next to his. And I learned a lot of things from him. He was a Texan. His name was Terrell, and I used to call him Turk Terrell. And he was very meticulous in accountings and his language and wills was very careful, and I learned plenty from him. Well, then, eventually in 1963, I reversed the usual procedure, which is to marry and then find a job. I married and then gave up my job, and I retired from Alexander and Green on a very friendly basis and became a client instead of a worker. And I practiced law from my home and did various work on charitable boards and trustee of my church and that sort of thing. My mother was growing older, and it was good for me to be at home because she at times, well, once she fell down in a faint, and I fortunately was on the spot and able to help her, but if I'd been across the East River at the office, no one would have been there in the apartment to help her. But my wife moved into the apartment with me, and we helped my mother in many ways till she finally passed away in 1970. And then there was nothing to keep us in New York, and we began to think about moving out, because at that time there were lots of muggings and drugs and so on. It wasn't the same as it had been before. Parking was very difficult. So my wife had been brought up here in that house next door,
Sure.
and this was home to her. And her cousin lives next door on the north side. So we bought this land from her cousin. And her cousin was a builder. And so we employed him to build this house. And I'm very pleased with his work. It's all carefully done. You'll find that there are no poor job anywhere. And this steel up above is the steel beams. That wasn't easy to put up.
Absolutely not.
He had a derrick here, put it up, and then roped it. There was a big wind that night, and he wondered if it would all fall down. But it didn't. And that's 8-inch steel tubing. And the house is as fire resistant as you can make it. But it's a cinder block and brick, and then inside wire lath, a rock lath, wire lath, and plaster. And this ceiling is a gypsum, and it won't burn. The workers tried with their cigarette lighters to make it burn. It won't burn. It's a mineral.
How did you meet Margaret?
I met her in my church in Brooklyn. And also I was on the board of the charity that she worked for. She worked for the Willoughby House Child Care Center. She was the director. And that was sponsored by Willoughby House, a settlement house. And I was on the board of the settlement house. And I naturally met her because I was signing the checks for the payrolls.
There you go.
And she would bring me the checks to sign, and I would sign them. And so I really can't remember whether I met her in church first or in the settlement house first. But we found out that she was, shall we say, indispensable to me. And we went to Europe a couple of times with Boy Scouts. I was the Boy Scout leader at that time for the troop sponsored by my church. So we went together, and we brought my mother and my wife would take my mother on trips different from the Scouts, because the Scouts might be taking a horseback trip or a bicycle trip, but Mother and Margaret would take a bus tour or something like that. And then at the end of my horseback trip or bike trip, we would meet and all join for dinner, and then we'd get the plane the next day and fly back to USA.
Yeah.
It was a very satisfactory arrangement.
Margaret played on a couple of plays here in Jamestown with Lucille Ball.
Oh, yeah.
What did she say about her?
Well, she said Lucille Ball was a kindly person and helped her. And Lucille Ball was in one play and had the part of the housemaid, and she stole the show from the leading lady. The housemaid was the most popular actress. Margaret has written on that subject, and it was in the Post-Journal some years ago. I could probably dig up the article if I took a lot of time. Well, after Fort Bragg, where I did administrative work for 13 months, I entered the pipeline to go to Europe. I first went to the Provost Marshal General School for a 1-month course in the military law applicable to an occupied country. And it was really, we studied both civil affairs, is where you're invited into the country, and military government, where you force your way in. But we studied both under very competent instructors. And then after I graduated from the 1-month school, I was sent to Boston University for an intensive course in French. I had had French in school and college, and this was really a course in the kind of French you need in being a link between the army and the civilian government. In other words, how do you get the waterworks going? How do you get the power going? How to arrange to get the local police doing what you want them to do. And that was a different kind of French, of course. Some of the people in this French course knew as much French or more than I did. But we were all ignorant of the military needs. Well, we were shipped out before completing the course at Boston University. I went to the port of embarkation at Boston, and we entered on a ship called the Masterson, which had been a Holland American Line ship, but it was converted to a troop ship. And I was in a room which normally would have been for 2 deluxe passengers, and there were 6 officers in there. But we managed very well, and one of the things was that you had to wear a life preserver whenever you left your room, because they said that if we get torpedoed, the taxpayer has a right to find a life preserver on every corpse. So, of course, we went over in blackout conditions in a convoy, and we were not torpedoed. We ended up at Liverpool, and during blackout, we marched to a troop train. I went to Manchester, a British Army installation. And at that time, they were mixing British and American teams to go into France. So I was assigned to the British. I took various courses with them. One was driving the Bedford truck, which is a little different from a GM truck, but it was not a bad truck. And during the days before D-Day, we'd be out with these trucks, and we'd see the American airplanes and gliders going over, but they were mainly practicing. It wasn't the real thing. But then one day it was the real thing. And I was in a Bedford truck and saw these big DC-3s towing gliders and bombers going over, ships loading tanks at Eastbourne, where I was with the British on the Channel coast. They were waterproofing the tanks in the street, and it was a restricted area. And we didn't get any bombs there, but in our hotel room, which I shared with a British officer, a machine gun bullet had come through the roof and taken a chip off the wash basin.
My gosh.
That was in the days before they threw the upper hand. But in that early period, Eastbourne used to be one of the things that the Nazi aviators bombed and strafed for practice. It was their graduation exercise to fly across the channel and shoot up Eastbourne. But we were getting V1s. V1s were rockets, and you didn't need to worry about V1s. In fact, we'd be outside the hotel having tea at 4 o'clock with the British officers. See the V1s go over towards London. But if the motor stopped, then you're worried because the thing would swivel down. You never knew where it would come. And you'd want to be behind a tree, a good big tree or a stone wall or something when it landed, because if it landed anywhere near you, there would be a terrific concussion. There were cases where it would land near a school. The children were all trained to get down under the desks, but you could see where the windows were blown out and the splinters of glass were blown right into the plaster of the wall. So if you'd been between the window and the wall, you would have been just full of these glass splinters. I was stationed in Munich in the military government occupation of Germany at the time of the Nuremberg Trials. And we would read every day in the Stars and Stripes, the little military newspaper, about what was going on. We didn't get a full report, but we got some idea of what was going on. Of course, there were legal issues there that were very troublesome to me, like trying people for waging aggressive war. If we had lost the war, would we want General Eisenhower charged with waging an aggressive war? And there were other problems, crimes against humanity. Well, I suppose there are people here in the United States who committed such crimes. Maybe somebody's grandfather was a slave owner and maybe killed a slave, for all I know.
Yeah.
So I did feel that it was a bit of a pot calling the kettle black, but it was our policy and I supported it.
Ever get down to Nuremberg at all?
I drove through it on the way home to catch the troop train. I was commander of the troop train in June 1946, and it was an interesting experience. Most of our detachment military government, which had once had a strength of 130 people, about 100 officers and 30 enlisted men, was down to about 8. And I had plenty of points to go home, and I was facing either going home or becoming a civil servant over there. I didn't want to become a civil servant, so I put in for transfer home, and I went with others in military vehicle up to Nuremberg, and then I got on the troop train and was in a 40 and 8 with another officer, and we also had the records of all the men on the train. In that 40 and 8, it took about half the car. So the cars forward of that were passenger-type cars, coaches, and in Europe they call voiture. You know, have a side opening door, you could step out. Well, I arranged to have a sergeant who was also a lineman. You know, he had spurs to go up a telephone pole and had necessary equipment to tap into the line. And told him, whenever the train stops, you go up the pole and you telephone Paris and tell them the train has stopped. Because very often the engineers would stop the train, have a night with their girlfriend, and then start the train up in the morning.
Yeah.
I didn't want any of that. I remember another experience I had was this 40 and 8 had a sliding door, and it was open for some reason. I've forgotten, maybe it was so we could get out and have mess. They had feeding stations along the line. But anyway, after it was no longer necessary to be open, I wanted it closed because we were responsible for those records and I didn't want anything to happen to them. So a worker, track worker, came along and I said, "Monsieur, fermez la porte, s'il vous plaît." And so nothing happened. I then leaned out, and then he had his shoulder right and went whoof right past my nose, just past my hand.
My golly.
I was lucky.
Oh, yeah.
I might have been beheaded.
Oh, yeah. Who are the most interesting folks that you've met, David?
Margaret Blossom.
Perfect.
And of course, Greg Peterson. I think John Selstrom's a very interesting person.
When you came back here, you became very active in a lot of things. Town justice. Going from a legal practice of which you did wills and estates and trust to all of a sudden becoming a town justice. That must have been quite a transition for you.
It was. My experience with criminal law had been only in the military.
Yeah.
So I had to learn things like the vehicle and traffic law, and I found it very interesting. I met a lot of different people, and I hope I did a good job. Toward the end of my 4-year term, I was diagnosed with prostate cancer.
Mm-hmm.
I'm grateful to Roswell for making it so I've never had a recurrence of the cancer.
Since you've been back, have you been involved in Boy Scouts back in Chautauqua County?
Yes, the Bar Association sponsored a troop of scouts who are interested in law, and I took them on various trips. One of the scouts was Lisa C. Marsh, the daughter of Murray Marsh. She was a bright girl, and I took the scouts to see courts like the city court, and then took them down to see the Pittsburgh Law School, and we did other legal enterprises, and I was very glad to have done that for a couple of years. Doman Rovich had an idea that he wanted to develop the land that overlooks the parking lot at the airport. It was full of pits the topsoil had been taken off and so on. And he came to me and asked me about it. I told him he needed some non-profit corporation like Fenton's Historical Society or something to be the cover for him so that people could make tax-exempt gifts. Well, he tried various things. He tried getting the county to sponsor it, and tried the Fenton's Historical Society. They all turned him down. And I suggested the Community Foundation. And he went there, and Francis Grove told him, we'll take in money for funds, but we won't sponsor an air museum. So Joe and I raised the money for a fund for the air museum. I already had a fund there, a Blossom Fund, which was small, but it will be the pour over from my estate. And I expect that if the market doesn't completely shrivel up, the Blossom Fund will be $1 million or so. That's for education. But I started with Joe's help, the Air Museum Fund, and after we had raised the initial $5,000 and established the fund, Francis Grove wrote to the lady who was the wife of the founder of the telephone company, say Lucille Wright, who lived in Cody, Wyoming. And he wrote such a good letter that she sent a check for $50,000
Wow.
to the Air Museum Fund. So that gave us a big boost. Well, then I established various other funds. Some of them Margaret was interested in. One of them is now called the Helga Holtz Mozart Club Music Scholarship Fund. And then we established the Lucille M. Wright Air Museum Scholarship Fund to send youngsters down to send them to the space camp in either Florida or Alabama. I understand there's another one in California now.
Mm-hmm.
We haven't sent anybody to California.
Yeah.
But we've had plenty go to Huntsville, Alabama, and Titusville, Florida.
You've left quite a legacy here, Dave Blossom.
Well, nothing like what you leave.
Not at all. I tell you, between you and Margaret, you guys were have been tremendous impacts in the area. I mean, really wonderful leaders, charitable philanthropy. I tell everybody about you coming in and setting up funds and challenging people to match it.
Yeah,
You were one of the first people to do that.
yeah.
I think that's terrific. The Community Foundation's almost $40 million now.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, it's just terrific.
Yeah,
Just terrific. You've been terrific.
I wouldn't say that.
Oh, it really has.